everyone, and welcome to the Chief Science Officer Zoom In on Science Calls, where we learn about STEM professionals and their careers to understand the impact of their job in modern life. My name is Siyasa Dhanushya from Kenya. I am personally excited to host today's call. So, for all of us to enjoy this experience, please mute your microphones and post your questions at any time during the presentation in the chat box. Today, we welcome Heather from US Agency for International Development to Zoom In on Science. Heather, can you tell our participants a little about yourself and your work? Please share your slides and remember participants, post your questions in the chat. After the presentation, we will ask the questions posted in order.
The U.S. Agency for International Development is an agency that does humanitarian and development assistance. And what that means is that we go and help other countries set up systems, help with their governance processes, their health systems, education. When there's a crisis, we do humanitarian assistance. So for example, when there's an earthquake, like in Haiti and Nepal, the most recent, if there's a big war and people have to leave their homes and go to another country, we do refugee support and those types of things. This is a way that the American people help other developing countries reach success. How can they be their own country and help their own citizens? So that's where I work. But how did I actually get there is a little bit of a story. So I'm actually an accountant, and I started my career many years ago, more than I want to admit to. And I am from Arizona. I went to the University of Arizona. And after I graduated, I started working in public accounting. And I really didn't like working for wealthy people. I thought it was kind of a drag. I'd have somebody call me and say, I really don't want to pay my taxes, figure out how I don't have to contribute so much to what's going on around me in both our country and then the taxes that go to, for example, my agency to help others. I feel like more philanthropic work was more suited for me. But it took me a little while to get there. I had to work in public accounting, and then I worked in private companies for a while. I did consulting on my own. And then I finally took the leap and joined the US Agency for International Development in 2010. And what an amazing experience it's been, because it took me to countries I would never have gone to, for example, Congo and Mali. I met an amazing husband in Congo, and I've learned a lot about what it means to work in different cultures and how to live in a multicultural family. That's the neat thing about USAID, is we're bringing diplomacy and development. And then I have many connections all over the world that bring much more flavor to my life and make my life much more in-depth than it ever would be just being an American. I also work with a lot of really, really intelligent people across a lot of different types of sectors, including environment, education, agriculture, humanitarian assistance, for example, economic growth, working on private companies, global health, which could be anything from maternal and child health to things like malaria, COVID-19, which is affecting all of us today. We have democracy, human rights, and governance, because that's very important to us in America. And then we have crisis, conflict, and instability, where we try and help countries that are going through a rough patch, figure out how to get their systems in place and provide the services to their people. But what's really interesting as a STEM person is there's a lot of science, technology that comes into all of these programs. I have a quick video I wanted to show you that I thought might bring a little bit more flavor to our discussion today. Can you hear now? Thank you.
I believe that ideas can come from anyone and anywhere, and I've seen this happen with our work. I am the first person in my entire clan to graduate from college. If I didn't go to school, I would be in the village grazing cows. I would have no opportunity. I decided to quit my job and launch Ecofio Africa after finding my kid sister crying because of unsustainable levels of deforestation. Wood was hard to come by in my village. So she had to walk up to 10 kilometers a day to gather wood. And because of that, she couldn't go to school. That was the spark. That's when I really started thinking of alternative sources of fuel other than wood. This is a kiln. A kiln is made out of old oil drums. So we give these kilns to farmers and train them how to use them to carbonize their farm waste into a product called char, which is a powder. Then we take that char and use another piece of technology called a briquetting machine that we use to compress this powder into briquettes that we then package and sell through a network of micro retailers who are predominantly women, because women invest any income they make in their families. Ecofuel briquettes burn longer than traditional charcoal from wood, burn cleaner, so they are safe to use indoors, and cost much less than charcoal from wood, so they save people money. It took us more than a year to get a product that we could use. We had to fail many times, and after like a year, we had a product that people accepted. But our technology is still evolving. What I can say to fellow Ugandans who want to address challenges in their communities is you can never know what you can achieve unless you go out and try.
So I found that story quite inspiring. It's one of the reasons I really enjoy working for USAID, is because we work with a lot of people who have a lot of great ideas, but just don't have the connections or don't have the resources. And so we can bring that type of change and fuel what the innovative ideas that are coming from where you're living or where you're working. I found that inspiring. I hope you did too. I have just a few more sort of minor comments, and then I think we can go to the Q&A. And that is, we deal with a lot of development challenges. Around the world, people are suffering in different ways. Some don't have food on their tables. Some don't have enough water. Some have climate change. Some are looking for new ways of energy, like ecofuel in Africa. Some are overwhelmed by the urbanization and the trash that's around them. And then like today, we have pandemic disease. Those are all really, really challenging topics to deal with. But it's inspiring young folks like you and those who you're working with who are going to have the best ideas. So don't be afraid to share those, because you might have that next new technology, that next new app that helps a farmer get product to market, who helps stop that disease before it happens, or helps reduce the urbanization effects and brings more efficiency to those around you. One never knows. It's your clever minds that I can't wait to hear from in the future. So with that, hopefully we can go to Q&A.
Thank you very much for telling us about your work. It is evident you're truly passionate. I have a question. Who was your mentor as a child?
I think there have been many, but when I was asked that question the other day, I had to really think hard on who I thought might be the most inspiring person to share with you. And I'd like to share Teresa Harrington. I actually didn't meet her until I was a junior in high school. And I actually was taking care of their children just off and on throughout the year of my junior year. But then I had a hardship in my family where my parents had to move away. And I was really sad about that because it was going into my senior year, which is a super important time for me. And they took me in, Teresa and her husband and her 2 kids. But I think the reason that I found her the most inspiring is that all through school, I had done really well. I got my high marks. I studied hard. I did what was expected, but I actually was really struggling. I couldn't read as fast as everybody else, and I felt inferior. I had asked the counselor at school for help, and she sort of just laughed at me and thought I was gaming the system, trying to find some kind of an out for some reason. It wasn't until I talked to Teresa about it that she actually found me a resource, and I actually was able to improve my reading speeds and was able to finally pass the test to go into college. I actually couldn't go to college right away. And I found that just amazing how I could have such high marks and not get into college. So I would say that Teresa was that mentor for me. She believed in me. She believed that I had a problem, and she let me air that problem. And I felt that that was the most important thing.
Okay, that's really cool. Before we get to the participants' question, I have another question. Okay, so what advice would you give to your 14-year-old self?
That's a hard one for me, I think. I am kind of an introvert by nature. I like reading my books. I like hanging out at home. COVID and having to work from home is really not a big deal for me because I could be shut in with sort of no sound for days on end. But when you're 14, it's really kind of hard to fit in when you're like that. And I think I would tell myself it's okay to be me. I think I worried too much about what others thought. And really, at the end of the day, it's really helped shape me. The time I spend learning from myself, learning from others in those books, and then being able to ask questions and connect in a different way than I think the extroverts are.
Okay, thank you very much for your participation. Okay, so we have a question from Kelly. What has been your favorite project to work on so far?
Wow. I think I would probably have to, I'd have to say, that's a hard one. I'm going to go with the Central Africa Regional Program for the Environment. The reason is that it's a program that covers the Congo Forest Basin, so a number of different countries. And I think the reason I would pick that is it's a lot of countries with a forest that has to do right by the rest of the world, but in a region of the world that isn't known for the best institutions for managing it. But yet the program has been around for 20 years, and it has made a lot of progress in that time to bring awareness to not having deforestation, as well as what the value of the animals are within the forest. And I think it's one of those projects that doesn't just touch on the lives of the people in the country, but the lives about the broader world around them.
Okay, we have a question from Claire. How many people work in the US or outside the US for USAID?
Okay, so that's a question I'm going to have to get back to you on. I actually don't remember the total numbers, but it's several thousand. So we have what we refer to as a mission in many different countries, predominantly Africa, Latin America. There are a few in Central and East Asia. We generally have overseas mission sizes of anywhere from 20 people up to a couple thousand. So it depends. Kenya, by example, is a regional mission for us. So there are a lot more people that are situated in Kenya than there are in others. For both the Congo and Mali, where I worked, the average size was about 150 people. We generally use a combination of different types of employees. So we have American diplomats, which would be my context. We generally have anywhere from 10 to 20 that are stationed at the mission. And the rest of our staff is local professionals. So people with technical expertise in their country and in the sector in which they work. In the United States, Washington, D.C. is obviously our biggest office as our headquarters with several thousand people.
Okay, we have a question from CSO Dia from Kenya. Okay, as a person who loves being around nature, I would like to know, have you personally had an opportunity to work with an activist? If so, how was the experience and did it bring new ideas?
I have not had a direct experience with an activist, but by extension, yes, when I did work with Carpe. I think if you take, for example, Virunga, which is a national forest in eastern Congo, It's an area where there are supposedly oil and gas reserves that people want to be able to tap into. But by doing that, there would be overall destruction of the Virunga forest. Very disheartening when you're trying to save that forest. There are a number of activists in that region, both international and locals. And I think what's empowering about what they have to say is they bring a level of not just the responsibility to themselves and to the forest, but how is it that money can drive everything around us? And I think that's what's more inspiring about their message, is that we too often think about making riches instead of what we can do, the social riches of people around us.
Okay, thank you. Our next question comes from CSO Rudra from Kenya. States, what challenges did you have when you were entering USAID?
So to get a job with USAID is a little bit different depending on which category you come in as. So as a Foreign Service Officer, the biggest challenge is whether or not they're actually hiring. So we are at the mercy of the US Congress. And unfortunately, for many, many years, USAID was unable to hire new staff. I was the fortunate beneficiary of a hiring period in between 2010 and about 2015, where they saw the value in increasing the amount of diplomats. I think the hardest thing for me was coming into government service and what that brings or what that entails, which is very different from working in a private company. To be a little bit more specific on what that means, private companies have a lot of flexibility. They tend to do what they want. Certainly they might have to follow some rules, whether by legislation or what their city or town or what the people around them want. But generally speaking, they're going to do what they want to make their profits. When you work for the government, you have to care about everybody, because everybody has a stake in something that you're doing, and not everybody is going to like it. So that's the difference. I would say if you're overseas, for example, in Kenya, and interested in a future in working with USAID, that's an equally difficult process to get through. You definitely have to show your experience. And unfortunately, in many countries, it's very difficult to get that first internship or to get that first experience that someone will find credible. So what I encourage people when I'm overseas, is to remember that there are a lot of things that you do to get experience that may not be paid. So things like this: how did you lead? How did you moderate? Use those experiences and apply them to whatever USAID would be looking for in that example.
Okay, that's
Hopefully
amazing.
I got all the question.
We have a question from CSO Haley from Oregon. Okay, what was your educational path? Did you always know that what you wanted to do?
I can definitely say I didn't always know. From about age 4, I always said I was going to be a pediatrician. And I got to college thinking I was going to be pre-med, and I made it 3 weeks. I hated being in chemistry and doing the lab. And I promptly went over to the business school. And then looking through all of their options, I said, ooh, I don't like marketing. That's too much excitement. And I picked accounting by just pointing at it. And I happened to be pretty good at it, somewhat mathy. And so that's where I kept my job. The interesting thing is I hate doing accounting every day. In fact, I search for every other opportunity to do something other than accounting. And luckily, I'm far enough in my career that I don't have to do accounting every day anymore. I think that's where you have to be sort of ready. You can do all the studies that you want, but don't ever turn down the opportunities that you find that you're passionate about. For me, I hate inefficiency. I like to make new processes. I like to figure out what's the root cause of a problem. I don't like it when someone says, we're just gonna do it because we've always done it, and that just drives me nuts. So the problem with those types of questions is it's more about change management. And so what I find enjoyable about my day is learning and seeing how people are reacting to the topics that we're talking about, trying to figure out why they are against a change or why they're for a change, and really trying to work the change management aspect, which really has nothing to do with keeping debits and credits for somebody's books.
Interesting. Okay, this question comes from CSO Fatma from Kenya. If you weren't working with USAID, what would you be doing right now?
Oh, probably suffering through another tax season. So in the United States, for those who don't know, our tax cycle is annual, and I typically on a corporate cycle would be closing books every quarter or submitting taxes about now, other than COVID. And, you know, it's great because you're making sure the money's going into the government coffers to go off to good things like USAID. But that's probably where I would have been stuck had I not taken sort of the leap of faith that I needed to get out of what I was doing and change gears and work in a different industry.
This question is from CSO Austin from Pennsylvania. Do other countries have agencies similar to USAID, and do you ever team up with those foreign agencies?
So yes, there are a lot of the Western and countries that do have bilateral assistance, is what we refer to. We do a lot of work with all of the different agencies. It's something, if you are familiar with the United Nations, it's something similar in terms of coordination. So all the development agencies meet regularly, both in country and at the national levels, to help guide and coordinate policy. It's getting better over the years. So maybe 20 years ago, you would have perhaps the United Kingdom and Sweden and the US and maybe Brazil and some other countries all working in a developing country and not talking to each other. And that's not really that effective. If you're all trying to solve the same problem, then you're sort of stepping on each other's feet and you're probably delaying a lot of the progress. So in the last several years, especially in the last 10, there's been a lot more work to harmonize. So what we're doing now is they have generally in most countries, agreements between the countries to say, I have so much money, I have this type of a program I'm going to implement, and I'm looking at this region. So at that point, you're not doing the same work in the same region. We also have agreements with countries where we have other countries give us money, and they put money into our programs because we can cover whatever it is their initiative is, and it just gets the spread of those development dollars. So there are a lot of development dollars. Now there's different types of assistance, right? So we're talking about actual giving of programs, health programs, or improving systems or government institutions. There are other countries that donate money for infrastructure. So maybe building roads, building dams, whatever the case may be. We do a lot less of that in the United States now, but over time or collectively, there are a different group of donor countries.
Thank you so much. We have a question from CSO Vivek Raj from Kenya. How would you describe your availability?
Can we get a little bit more precise? I'm not quite sure I understand the question.
I'm just asking about her availability in terms of her job and spending time with her family.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification. So that's one thing I do appreciate with this job versus working in the private sector. I can tell you that before joining USAID as a consultant running my own company, I worked a lot. In fact, I was working 20 hours a day, 6 days a week. because I had to address all my clients. So a common day for me at that time was getting up at midnight my time, because I lived in San Diego and I needed to talk to whatever client was on a different continent many hours ahead of me. And then I would maybe take an hour or two off to get myself organized, go into clients, work all day, come home around 6, maybe give myself a couple hours, get a couple hours of sleep, and then I was right back at it. That's really not a good, healthy lifestyle. Thankfully, at the time, I was not married, and I certainly did not have my 6-month-old child. So things might have been very different had that been the case. What I do find here is that I continued that lifestyle that way because it was sort of programmed into me until about 2013, 2014. I, in fact, got exceptionally sick, actually almost died in the Congo from meningitis. And, you know, I was really disgruntled. I said I got medevaced to South Africa, then I had to go to the United States, and I actually had to end my tour and work from Washington. And I was like, I'm leaving my job behind. How can this possibly happen? But it was an amazing 7 months that I had to spend in the United States, not only just getting healthy physically, but it actually gave me a time to realize what was truly important in life. I was married by that point. My husband was certainly not wanting me to not be there the next day. But at the same time, it actually made me understand my staff a little bit better and how to give a different type of lifestyle that they were living in. I work in a lot of different cultures where being home with family is much more important than being in the office, where attending the funeral or the birthday or the marriage is what's more important. And I was really sort of missing that when I first started with USAID because I didn't really understand it myself. So until then, I didn't make that time. But now I go in at the start time for whatever embassy I'm at, I leave on time, and I call my staff to make sure that they have left, because there's always a few that think they have to stay longer than me. Now, I have a 6-month-old, and I certainly hope that I'll be more in his life than in the life of anybody I'm working with.
Really cool. Okay, we have a question from CSO Frutik from Kenya. Hi, Ms. Heather. It's really awesome how USAID cares for the world and try and terminate the leading problems that they're facing. In 8th grade, I tried to solve the world's leading problem, which is global warming, by using a thermoelectric generator in chimneys and car exhaust by using the waste heat produced and then transform it to electrical energy using temperature difference between both the ends of the TEC. Is there any advice you would give us to think big and approach big names in the country, persuading them to adapt the ideas that would potentially save the world?
Yes, indeed. That's going to be always the hardest, getting your foot in the door. And certainly as a younger generation, right, people are going to say, oh, that's just a kid. That can't possibly work. And unfortunately, that's not always the case. Sometimes you have that ingenious idea because you're looking at the problem differently than everybody else. I have on my slides, and I can try and launch, is a link to our innovation lab. So USAID, as a big bureaucratic organization, I showed you all of the different sectors, but we also have what we call the innovation lab. And they work with enterprises to ensure that they can tap into finding grantees to develop these types of ideas or bring the idea to a particular project, working with one of our other partners in country. So I'm going to try and pull up that while we go on to the next question. I'll pull up our website so that you can get that address, or I can drop it into the chat so that you have it. And then that way you can see for yourself sort of more in depth all the different types of opportunities just through USAID, either from the Washington perspective or through our partners.
Last question is from CSO Malhar from Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
It says, do you have to work on the field currently during the pandemic as part of USAID? And if yes, what is USAID supposed to contribute?
So this is one of those strange times in my life where I am not actually overseas. And I've been spending the last year getting another master's degree with the Air University, which is the US Air Force at the Air War College. So I've been studying for the last 10 months and actually getting ready to wrap up on Thursday to get our diploma. So it's been a little unusual for me to not be sort of in the thick of things. But what I can say is that USAID is responding internationally. So we have a task force that's looking at individual countries and what their needs may be. Typically, when Congress gives us money, which we call appropriating money, they tell us what we have to use it for. So it's going to go to a specific health program. It could be to fight cholera, for example. And what we're actually seeing is that we're working with Congress to take money that we have and change that money to respond to COVID. They have ventilators going out to particular countries that may need them. Perhaps it's getting other types of resources. So globally, they're looking at what the individual infrastructure and shortages are and trying to respond in that way. Now, granted, that's a tough question, right? Because the United States is also having issues today. And I think that's one of the interesting things about USAID and how we fit in to US national interests. You're going to hear Americans who say, we have to focus at home, and you're going to have others who are going to say, let's focus overseas. So our agency has to balance those two different perspectives and be able to bring resources both home in terms of through other agencies, and then what we can provide through USAID.
Okay, that sounds really cool. Thank you very much for your participation today. Before we close this call, what advice would you give to us as young leaders for our future?
Stay engaged and don't ever fear asking the question. I find it inspiring that you're calling in from all over both the United States and all over the world to show your passion for STEM. I think that's the first thing that you can embrace. So it's just not losing out. If you fail, don't let that failure stop you. It's just a learning point. How do you reassess and find a different avenue or start again?
Thank you for joining us today. You are an inspiration to many of us, and we hope that you can participate in another call someday as we continue to zoom in on science. CSOs, please unmute and join me with saying our motto. CSOs, don't just hope it happens.
Make it happen.
It happened.
Thank you all for letting me participate with you today. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for joining us, Heather. It's really nice to see you. It's so nice to have that international representation too. So understanding the students in Kenya, having them join the call today, and just our international network. So we appreciate you so much. And Yusha, you did an incredible job. First time hosting.